and welcome. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And as I mentioned, we are in chapter 5 of Getting Good at Getting Older. Last week we looked at ages 0 to 7 and then 8 to 14. So we're going to think back right now to when we were 15 years old, those of us who grew up Jewish, post-bar bat mitzvah age, maybe into college for many of us. And what we're looking at is significant moments and events of each phase of life, people who guided and influenced us during that period, and how did each phase contribute to the continuum of your life. So with that in mind, is there anyone who wants to jump right in? Okay, well, I will just mention 2 teachers who had significant impacts on me during that phase of my life. One is a person who I know has gone on to become a person who is very controversial, and that is Dennis Prager. So he's gotten to be a very, very, I would say, radical conservative, and for some people, so much so that he's a problematic lightning rod. But back in the day, he was my Hebrew high school teacher and youth group leader in Brooklyn, and just a very important, strong influence in my thinking. I think about the books that we read. That's when I was first introduced to Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which, if you know that book, you know how powerful it was. And if you don't know that book, I strongly encourage you to find and read it. We also read Eric Fromm's You Shall Be as Gods, which I quoted recently in my Torah study class. So between the books that we read and discussed and the conversations that we had the only youth group that never had an activity. You know, we never went bowling, we never went to the movies. The only activity was sitting around and talking, which was a precursor to his 3-hour talk show format career. And my mom is on the call here, so she'll validate that. I have told Dennis that I think that he developed his 3-hour format on the phone with me between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. On a regular basis, several times a week, because I know my parents would come into the room at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, "Get off the phone." Is that the truth, Mom?
Absolutely.
So there was.
I think you had a crush on him also.
Yeah, I think the feeling was mutual, but you know, we were, you know, of an age where that was not going to happen. Then the other person on the other end of the spectrum was Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is the author of this chapter that we are reading, and I had the wonderful good fortune to study with him. I went to college. I was 17 when I left to go to Brandeis, and I was in a big hurry to graduate high school and college. So I raced through high school and college, and I graduated from college when I was 20 and started rabbinical school. And Reb Zalman was one of the teachers that I had in rabbinical school. So I studied with him not only in rabbinical school, but also we were required to do an outside master's degree. I did a master's degree in religion at Temple University, and Reb Zalman was one of the teachers at Temple as well. So I was exposed to him at both institutions, and another formative influence when I think about people who guided and influenced me during that period. And Zalman went on to be the officiant at David and my wedding. So a very close connection. High school for me, so we're looking at ages 15 to 21. So that was the high school era. I attended John Dewey High School in Brooklyn, New York. Dewey was an experimental high school set up by the New York City Board of Education to be a model based on the philosophy of John Dewey. And it was focused on experiential education and learning at one's own pace, which allowed me to, get through high school in 2.5 instead of 4 years, because the school was set up so that you could do a lot of independent study like that. I would say that among the regrets of my life is that I was in such a hurry in high school and college that I don't feel like I got as much out of those experiences as I could have if I had just slowed down and taken my time. I did college then in 3 years and did a double major, so I wasn't really able to study terribly much outside of the areas of my major and of what the school requirements were. So I look back at age 20 with a little bit of regret that, I knew I wanted to be a rabbi, and I was in such a hurry to get to be a rabbi that and it's rabbinical school is 5 years after college. So I knew, it felt like forever. And I wanted to move forward as fast as possible. And now I look back and I think, why was I in such a hurry to go to work? The rest of my life to work, it would have been nice to expand my horizons a little bit more, but be that as it may, that's where I was from 15 to 21.
I think you left something out.
What?
The court.
What's that?
The court case.
Oh, the court case. So some of these folks may have heard about that. Well, at a service we did, I don't know, a little while ago, we were somehow recognizing our high schoolers, and Rabbi Mari asked me to share the story that my mom is referring to. So I had the interesting experience while I was in high school of suing my high school principal, and you can still look up that court case, Coppell versus Levine, in the Judge Jack B. Weinstein in the New York State Courts of Appeal. So I was the editor of the high school literary magazine, and one of my friends, a guy named Donald Margulies, wrote a short story that I published in the literary magazine, and he used the F word in that twice as an expletive, and the principal confiscated the magazine, and the ACLU called me up and said, "Do you know your rights?" And I don't know my rights, but they said they would like to represent me in getting back the magazine and being able to disseminate it. So that is exactly what happened, and we went to court. I can remember how my legs were trembling sitting on that witness stand. But sure enough, we went to court. We won the case, and here was Judge Weinstein's comment that has always stayed with me. He said, "My role here is not to question the good sense of the New York City Bureau of Education, which, with all its enormous problems, devotes itself to the suppression of this fine example of student literary work." And fine example of student literary work, Donald Margulies, the author of that story, has gone on to win a Pulitzer Prize for his work on Broadway. He's had many shows produced on Broadway, and yeah, you could probably look him up and see some of those. So yeah, that was another big adventure, ages 15 to 21. You're absolutely right. So Mom, can you think back to 15 to 21? What?
Oh, my big adventure, I married your father.
Yeah, that's right.
I got married when I was just short of my 21st birthday. And going away to a college that out of town was a big deal, but I only stayed 2 years because I knew that at the end of 4 years, I'd be able to do nothing when I got out of Brandeis with a liberal arts degree. And I did not feel like I was going to go to any more school after that, though I did go on for a master's, many years later. But so I came back to Brooklyn College, and of course I had your father I was going out with him, and he lived right across the street. So that was my childhood sweetheart.
Yeah, my parents grew up across the street from each other, and I don't know if this is true, but supposedly for my father's bar mitzvah, my mother's father gave him a pair of binoculars as a gift, so that he could like look into my mom's bedroom window. The windows faced each other across the street. I don't know if that's apocryphal or if it's a true story.
I don't know either. Not that I remember.
Yes, Jane. Jane, you need to unmute.
Days of years.
Oh,
My
oh.
father can you hear me?
Yeah.
My connection may be bad. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Shake your heads. No, yes. Okay. So during those years, my father had a used car business. So needless to say, I had a car at my disposal at any time. And in the morning, I was like the minibus picking up all my friends to go to high school. So back then, obviously the cars were quite big, and I could get up to 8 people in the car very comfortably. And I had a certain route that I would pick everybody up, and we'd have a great old time and get to school. And sorry to say, I probably ruined a few of those cars for my father that I claimed somebody else must have done it, not me. But from schoolwork, my grades were okay, but my SATs, pardon my language, sucked. I could not figure out how to take an SAT to get a good score. So I kept on getting rejections and rejections and rejections from various colleges until the last possible college must have been very desperate and said, "We have room for you." And thank God that was the only place that was going to take me at that time. I studied hard. Grades didn't come easy to me, but I finished with a B average. And it took me every night studying 6-7 hours to get that B. And from an achievement standpoint, I always felt good that even though I didn't understand the SATs and how to get good scores, I was able to get through college with a B average. So that was the piece that I felt good about during those years.
So where did you go and what did you study, Frank?
I don't want to degrade the school because it's really upgraded since that time. It was Boston University.
Oh, my son went there.
And what was your major?
Finance and accounting.
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for me, it was kind of a traumatic time in my life because, I told you last time that I grew up in New York City in Manhattan, but right after my bar mitzvah, when I was about 14, my father had been working in Paterson, New Jersey. So around 14 and a half to 15 is when we moved from New York City to Paterson. Besides, the neighborhood was changing in New York, and I wound up leaving Bronx High School of Science in my freshman year and moving to Paterson, where I went to Eastside High School. Now, most people would remember that school maybe if you ever saw a movie called Lean on Me.
Yes.
It's a story of Joe Clark, who was not the principal when I was there, but it was rather eerie for me to watch the beginning of that movie. And it was actually filmed in the high school because I remember I've still got pictures of many of those places, and showing how it has changed. Just one interesting thing about that high school is that the mascot was we were called the Ghosts. Why? Because our football field was built on a cemetery. So they had moved all the bodies out of the
Oh,
way when
wow.
we were building the high school to another place, and so in order to get us a football field. Also, during that time, I spent a lot of time at the YMHA in Patterson. We had a big Y, and I remember one year, and I don't remember what year it was, whether it was probably around 1960 or so. Some of you folks who have Sirius XM radio may wind up listening to Cousin Bruce Morrow
Yes.
on Saturday night. Well, Cousin Brucey was, if you were from that area, you knew he was on ABC 77 AM, and he was also the MC for the Matzah Hop that year at the YMCA for the kids. He is Jewish, by the way, if you didn't know that. So he was our MC for the Matzah Hop that year, and so that was one of the fun things. And then I wound up going to Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey, to study chemistry. I was originally going to take biology and decided I really didn't. No offense, Alan, but I didn't want to be a doctor. So I figured I could do something something different with that, and I enjoyed the sciences. That was a kind of an interesting deal there, because we started out with 25 folks majoring in chemistry. 4 of us managed to graduate in 4 years. A lot of people left that curriculum, and it was rather challenging because we needed 6 people to take our last classes, including physical chemistry, and we didn't have 6 people, so we had to take them with the night school. So about my senior year is when I met Carol, and I was the only person on Friday night at the lab with a lab assistant, because she used to come down with me and spend some time, and then we'd go out after class. So it was kind of a fun time at that point. But that right after college, we'll talk about that later, is when I went into the service, and actually from that point on, I never lived back in that part of the world again. So, but it was a good time for me, a fun time for me. And oh, by the way, some of you folks also know my friend Judy Rothenburg. Judy was my high school prom date. She now lives in Aviano. So I have some fun with that every now and then when I introduce her to new folks. I introduce her. This is my wife, Carol, and my high school prom date, Judy.
Nice. How did you and Carol meet?
She will tell you the story. If she had an epidural today, so she's sleeping. But her normal line is that I picked her up in a bowling alley. Actually, we belong to B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, BBYA, and they had a young adult group, B'nai B'rith Young Adults, and it was 18 to 26, I think it was at that time. And we went bowling in Clifton, New Jersey, and on my way home, as Frank pointed out, we used to do a lot of carpooling back then because not everybody had access to a vehicle. So as I was leaving, I walked around and asked if anybody needed to ride home, and Carol had just had a fight with the guy she was going out with and had broken up with him, so she took my advice and we kind of hit it off. And 53, well, actually it's almost 60 years now that we've been together. So
Nice. That's awesome. So Joe, I'll tell you my high school chemistry story. I mentioned I went to this, hippy dippy experimental high school, and one of the things was it wasn't even pass fail. Our grades were M, MC, or R. So M was mastery. That means you got it. MC was mastery with condition, which means, okay, we'll let you move forward to the next module, but you have to make something up. And R was retained for reinforcement. Nobody failed. You were just retained for reinforcement. So I took chemistry in high school. It was a requirement. And I remember the teacher saying, I will let you pass chemistry if you promise me that you will never take chemistry again.
Yeah.
And I made that promise. I never took it again. I got an M. I never took it again.
Wow, that's funny.
I want to say it was Mr. Weiner, but I'm not sure what the teacher's name was. I could still picture him.
Yeah.
Any other true confessions from the high school years?
Well, I went to Fame, that movie where they have music and art, in one of the specialized schools in New York. And that was a tremendous influence upon my life. Had wonderful teachers. I mean, everybody was into music and everybody was into art. And it was part of the city schools in Manhattan. It's on Convent Avenue, right next to CCNY. And then I went on to Hunter College. But it was a bad time because my mom was getting very ill. She had cancer and she eventually passed away at 47 years old.
Oh,
So,
it's so hard.
yeah. And going to school, it wasn't that easy, trying to help her go for cobalt treatments. I don't know if anybody remembers cobalt treatments for cancer back then. So that
Jane,
left
what was your art or craft at?
I played piano and bassoon. Yeah.
Do you
And
still play either instrument?
no, I don't. I gave my baby grand to my daughter and granddaughter, and so now they play it.
When was the last time you played a bassoon?
Probably about 20 years ago.
Uh-huh. Do you have a shofar? I would think if you could play the bassoon, you'd be a good shofar blower.
Yeah, I know I don't have a shofar. I'd love to get one.
Yeah.
Oh, courage. Maybe this year you can join Cantor Woolman's chauffeur making class.
Right.
Yeah, you know, Joe, I don't know if we're going to be able to have that this year, sadly. But Joan certainly has shofarot in the gift shop. So I want to encourage you to make an appointment with Joan. Come get yourself a shofar and
I will.
join us blowing shofar. You could start with Elul. The month of Elul starts on August 21st, and you're supposed to blow the
Okay.
shofar every morning.
Okay. Thank
And
you, Rabbi.
I'm guessing you're going to have a fantastic aptitude.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, Marilyn.
Well, I too grew up in Brooklyn, and I also graduated high school when I was 16. That same year, that was 1965, I met Joel, and I decided that I was going to become a teacher. I think I knew that from when I was in kindergarten. And so I graduated high school. I met Joel, and we dated from 65 till we got married in 69. And I started Brooklyn College after the summer break, and took all my required courses. And then I was taking language. I took French and Spanish, so I have a minor degree in modern languages, and I have a degree in education. So also during those years, I believe, is when we decided that we would move to Phoenix. We took a cross-country trip by car, saw the USA, not in the Chevrolet, but in a Pontiac. And the following year, we moved to Phoenix. So we were married for 2 years, and we both had our degrees. We both got jobs here, and we've been here ever since. So it was really life decisions that I made in those years.
So what year did you come to Phoenix?
72.
Wow.
No, maybe it was 71. Looking at my,
Few changes since then, eh?
oh yeah. When we moved to Phoenix, there was a sign, I think by Dreamy Draw, which wasn't the current Dreamy Draw. It was a 2-lane highway through the mountains. And they had a sign, population 435,000 people or something like that. Now we're the 5th largest city in the country. So
Yes, Barbara.
quite young to get my whole life in order,
Yeah.
but it worked. I loved my teaching career. We married for over 50 years, so it's all good.
Yeah, you laid the foundation for some good decisions.
Yeah, but I was so young to make those kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, because I studied French, if I hadn't been dating Joel, I probably would have gone on a program. And he knew that. I really wanted to go to France and test my speaking of French. And so several years later, the first trip we took to France was going to Europe was going to France.
Barbara,
So I missed last week. I caught a little bit of it on the recording that you did. So thank you for doing that. Everything was okay. It would have been too distracting. I was with my daughter and the baby, and so we just left it off completely. But I did try to write everything down, and it didn't take me more than a half hour, 45 minutes, but I kind of did a shortcut because I was looking the way it said to do it in 52 and 53. And I put everything around the edges, and then I made lines to the years where things came up. But if we're talking from 14 to 28, was it?
right now we're in 15 to 21.
15 to 21.
Then
So high school years, I was young in high school and young graduating college also, but for different reasons. And just going back a little bit, in the Philadelphia area, there was such a shortage of teachers that there was no, they looked at when you were born. So I never got to go to kindergarten. And then when I started first grade, it was in the middle of the year, in like February, and I was the B class. So there was a 1A and 1B. I mean, I started 1A in the middle of the year, and then we all just, it was always a half year. And so when they got to some point when I was in 6th grade, they decided everyone was either going to skip a half a year or be left back a half a year. And I was always a good student. I don't think I ever had to work that hard, but it wasn't, it was elementary school. So I got to skip. It was more of the boys that got held back. So for that reason, I ended up being a baby birthday. And I think that worked to my detriment going through school, because I think in high school I was, it wasn't because I was in a rush to get through like you were, Rabbi. I was more into just the social life and getting good grades and, so when I was in high school, I feel like I did well, but I wasn't pushing myself. I didn't really know, it's kind of like I grew up with, well, I'll be a teacher, because I was told you're either a teacher or a nurse. Basically, I wish I would have known what the kids get to know now. Not that I didn't love teaching, but I think I would have done some things a little different. And then when I went on to college, I had just turned 17, and I went right into elementary education, and then graduated college right before I was even 21, and I was a teacher. I was teaching. And the other goal that I had in mind during those years was travel. And when I turned 18, one of my best friends and I traveled from Philadelphia to LA to have an experience of living on our own, because we were from this generation of row house Philadelphia, Jewish neighborhoods. I mean, nice areas where we were from, but where we lived home with our parents. We didn't get to go and live on campus anyplace unless you were in a sorority house usually, or I knew a couple people who did that. So we kind of felt like we were missing out. We didn't get to have that away experience. I always kind of felt like I missed something. We went and then it's like we were on the plane for the first time, and we got a little nutty, I think, living near the UCLA campus. I look back now and think, boy, I was pretty brave then. I don't know, because I'd been kind of like shy, at that point. And when I started after high school, or when I was at Temple University, one thing that happened to me there, I realized what a lousy high school I went to. It was never that difficult for me, but I never felt prepared. I never really learned how to write properly. And you realize it when you're in a class with other people and they're good, you're A students and they're A students. Well, why are they doing so much better now and I'm struggling? So I had a little of that going on. And what's interesting, it seems like everyone came from a program someplace that was spotlighted someplace. In fact, I knew about your program, Rabbi, in New York, because I was in education then. I think I was in master's program then. And the high school that I went to ended up being filmed the year after I graduated by a very famous filmmaker, Fred Weissman, documenting what high schools were like in 1968. So this was after I left, but my brother was still there and I still had other friends that were there then. And when this film came out, the Board of Education in Philadelphia decided that, it did not show the teachers in very good light for many reasons. And there was a big lawsuit about it, and it got forbidden from being shown in Philadelphia. There was a court order. It could not be shown within 500 miles or a couple hundred miles of Philadelphia for 50 years.
Wow.
So, and after that, but what it did end up doing is it ended up in the Library of Congress. And in fact, if you go on YouTube, I think you can even find it, or if you look it up, it's just called High School. And it is like, oh my gosh, I had most of those teachers. I walked those halls. Yes, they were disgusting.
Wow.
So I kind of felt looking back like, gee, I had a terrible, high school experience. But anyway, I had fun. The other thing that was mainly, I had fun. I didn't have these very educational goals of doing a whole lot with my life at that point. I mean, I thought being a teacher was, and then hopefully getting married and having my own kids. That's about where I was then. But I did do a lot of travel. Every summer I was traveling. That's the first time I did Israel. I was one of those books, the $5 a day books through Europe. I would go for a couple months. And I also made my such close friends during those years that, except for 2 of my 3 best friends who passed away unfortunately in the past couple of years, the rest of everybody I'm still in touch with to this day, including a women's group, which was a group of kind of women's livers. And that the first book that we worked on together was called My Bodies Ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we discussed that in our groups. But we met in my master's program at Temple University. And when the class was over, we were like, oh, well, we're going to miss each other. It was like a summer school program. And so we continued meeting all these years, but I moved away. I mean, I moved first to Phoenix and then other places until we came back here again. And so I lost touch with them, except for occasionally when I went back to Philly. And now everyone's meeting together on Zoom. So anyway, nothing super exciting. And I got married at 78. So we've been married in 1975. So we've been married for almost 45 years. So they were my years.
Nice.
In a nutshell.
I'm glad you took the occasion to actually go through the exercise in writing. That's impressive.
Okay. Rabbi, I apologize. I have a doctor's appointment, so I am going to have to sign off, but it was a very interesting group, and thank you for letting me join.
You are welcome anytime.
Thank you.
Yes, Sandy.
Well, I have to say that the years from 15 to 21 were pretty important in my life. I mean, we started off in being 16 years old. The big deal was Sweet 16 parties. And so I was going from Sweet 16 party to Sweet 16 party. I didn't have a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, so that was kind of what we did. And then before you know it, I was in college, but still going to Brooklyn College, so it was a commuter school. So I never got to go away and, you know, like Barbara was talking about, being on my own and seeing what the world was like. And before you know it, and I got married at 19. So I was like, I went from 16, Sweet 16 to 19 married. And I never really had that chance to be away from my parents, to be on my own and to grow up. And so I think that I got married too young. It was during the Vietnam War. Everybody was getting married early, and it seemed the thing to do. And like Barbara, my mother said, be a teacher. I could have done anything at that point, but that's what girls do. And women's lib was just starting then. So I didn't really consider that I had that many options. I was an elementary ed major in Brooklyn College. And then when I got out of college, there were no jobs. There were no jobs because it was the war and all the guys were teaching, and I didn't want to work in this terrible neighborhoods as a substitute. So that was the best thing that happened to me. I got involved in insurance and claims and working for an import-export firm. And I suddenly decided I like this. And, you know, one claims job led to another, Social Security, medical disability claims, and then law school. So it was like I was gradually becoming more and more independent. And then after law school, of course, I got a divorce. So then I really became independent. But I think it's all worked out, you know, in the long run. But that period from 15 to 21 was pretty significant in my life.
Yeah, you packed a lot into those years.
Yeah, a little too much. Okay.
Yes, Joel.
So I know it's hard for anybody to believe, but I kind of got into some trouble during a lot of those years. And I can tell you're shocked.
Shocked.
Frank Blake, don't say a word here. That era started with my parents going through a very difficult bankruptcy, and we really lost most everything, and that kind of set a stage for probably angst and unhappiness and just kind of a general foreboding feeling in our home in terms of my parents not really getting along very well, and some trauma and drama within the home. I ended up going to the University of Cincinnati. I was a very good student and had pretty high grades and high scores, but I couldn't afford to go to school anywhere, and I didn't qualify for any particular scholarships during that period. So when I graduated high school in '66, there were work-study programs out there called co-op programs. And the nearest two to Pittsburgh were the University of Cincinnati and Antioch College. And so I chose to go on a co-op program to Cincinnati, primarily because my brother was at Hebrew Union College, right across the street, so at least I would have some family.
Nice, right.
And I started with a terrible attitude, like, what am I doing in this insignificant school when I should have gone to a much better school? And probably by the second semester, I was on academic probation. I was getting into not serious trouble, but enough trouble. And I went back at the beginning of my sophomore year knowing I shouldn't be here. And it was in the middle of Vietnam. I had lost a good friend of mine from high school in the war the summer before because of what I talked about last week with my arthritic background. And I was not going to be eligible for the draft. I was 4F. And so I decided at the beginning of my sophomore year that I don't want to be in school anymore, and I don't want to even be around anybody I know anymore. And I quit school, much to the chagrin of my parents and my brother, by the way, who tried to do kind of an intervention at the time. And I don't want to say I was disowned, but my parents made it quite clear that if you make that call, you're totally on your own anyway. And I got on a plane and flew to Phoenix, Arizona. And I was 19 years of age, did not know a soul. I lived in a flop house on Van Buren and 6th Street called the Auto Lodge. And I got tough in a real hurry living on Van Buren. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any money. I had a few $100s to my name. And I ended up, this is probably one of the funnier stories in my history. Somebody told me from Cincinnati, a fraternity brother of mine, that if I ever really got into real trouble, I should call this, I still remember his name. His name was Butch Bilski, and he was from Shaker Heights, and he went to ASU. And they said, if you really get into the end of the world, call Butch, and somehow he comes from a lot of money, he'll help you out. So I kind of got to that point after about 2.5 months in Phoenix, and I called Butch, and he had me meet him out at the university at ASU. And one of his suite mates, it was a suite of two bedrooms, 4 people, had disappeared about a month before. And he said, why don't you just move in? And I said, okay. So I started living in a dorm at ASU. And in those days, when you would go to the cafeteria, you simply yelled off your name, and a guy was sitting there and he checked off your name. So that's what I did. I started living off the state of Arizona. I was selling encyclopedias, by the way, at night, door to door. And it went really well. I was playing cards to make some money on the side in the dorm, and I ended up in a gin game one night, literally getting into a fist fight with an RA that I caught cheating in a gin game. And 2 afternoons later at lunch, 2 guys in suits came into the cafeteria. And now I had a whole bunch of friends at ASU, even though I wasn't a student. And I still remember looking up, and I saw these 2 guys talking to the guy at the door, and he turned around and pointed at me, and I said, Butch, the gig is up. And one guy got across from me, one guy got behind me and asked for my student ID, which of course I didn't have one. And after 2.5 hours of very, very difficult negotiation on my part, I agreed that rather than being arrested and them calling the police for obviously fraudulently living off the state of Arizona, I would agree that I would walk, never be seen obviously there, and also had to sign something that I would never apply for admission to any state school in the state of Arizona. And so anyway, I ended up really living with some interesting people, including another flop house at 44th or 52nd Street. There used to be a restaurant called Riazzi's on Van Buren and 52nd Street. Barbara, you may remember this back in the early 70s. It was a really popular local family-owned restaurant. And Mrs. Riazzi I lived in a shack behind there. She would allow me to use her phone in the restaurant to receive calls or make calls. But anyway, I ended up going back to Cincinnati, getting my head back together again, and going to school. And I just wanted to get out as fast as possible. Cheryl and I met actually that summer because I just went to school full time. and paid for school by selling encyclopedias door to door, and never did the work study thing. But I always retained what I said to her and her family and anybody else is that I will never live in the Midwest or the East again. I simply felt too good physically living in Phoenix. And so I graduated in December of 70. And by December 28th, we had driven a Dodge with a little U-Haul with I think a 3x5 U-Haul with everything we owned behind it. And we came to Phoenix again, not knowing a soul, having no jobs, etc. And obviously we've been here ever since. And the only other real trauma that happened during that period of time is that 4 months after we got married, my mother got very sick all of a sudden and passed away within 72 hours of acute pancreatitis. And that was a real trauma for me because, again, I had been a pretty difficult late teenage kid. And my mother, because I had been sick as a child and I was the baby, she literally, I was her whole life in terms of wanting to take care of. And in the last few years of her life, I was not outstanding as a son or respectful as a son or certainly as loving as I wish I had been. And so for her to handle that loss in a very short period of time, and she was 54, by the way, and that was a difficult time for me that frankly took me a couple of years of therapy to kind of wander my way through to get to some solution. So anyway, I had some really interesting, and a lot of those experiences I will not share with you. All I can say is I was the epitome of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Well, so you and Jane have in common that you both lost your moms at a young age.
Right.
And I can't believe that you got Cheryl to get in a car and drive cross country with you with no prospects.
Her 95-year-old mother today still can't believe I did that.
I can understand why.
And we just celebrated our 50th last September, actually.
Nice, mazel tov. Richard, yes.
Yeah, I guess I grew up a little differently than most of you. First of all, at the age of 16, I couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. To say the least, I was very naive and very dumb. I don't know if I've ever grown out of that, but
where were you living at the time?
I was living in, when I was 16 years old, my father had just sold his business. He had a grocery store up in Duluth, which is up in northern Minnesota on the tip of Lake Superior. My father owned a grocery store, and of course he was forced out of business. Up there, if you were Jewish, you had to own a business because there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and a Jew had to own his own business. Nobody would hire him. So what we did is we sold the business and then bought a hotel in Superior, Wisconsin, which is like 2 miles from Duluth, Minnesota. It's a bridge separates it. So we moved to Superior, and so I was 16 years old, and that was in the middle of the 50s. And so we moved over there, and I worked at this third-rate hotel. People who lived there were mainly prostitutes who worked at the houses of ill repute, guys on the Great Lakes who did the iron ore boats. And the reason they did that is my father could only keep them sober as long as they were on the boats. When they were in dry dock, he had to do a lot of work to keep them sober. So there was a lot of experiences I had at that hotel, which I will not get into, but it was a great education for me. And so we really couldn't afford to send me away to school. And I wasn't the best student at that time because I wasn't interested in school. I was more interested in sports and, a lot of, and women and a lot of other activities. So I went to a state school in Superior. And after I graduated from there, I moved on to Minneapolis and didn't know what I wanted to do. So like Joel, I sold shoes for a year and, just did whatever I wanted to do. And then it was between the Korean War and Vietnam War. And so I really didn't have to worry about it, but I had a teaching degree. I went to a teacher's college. So I thought, you know what? I really don't know what I want to do. I know I don't want to teach the rest of my life, but let's try it. So I took up a job in Bemidji, Minnesota. For those of you that have never heard it, look at it during the winter. It is the coldest spot in the nation. In January and February, it gets to be 40 below. Not wind chill factor, actual temperature. I was up there for 2 years, loved it. But there were 3 Jewish families. I was one of them. There were 2 women who owned a clothing store and one other family that owned a natural gas company. So, and I realized I wanted more of a Jewish background. So I moved from there to Minneapolis, taught down in Minneapolis for a year, and then I was offered a job in Chicago and moved to Chicago when I was about 21 years old. So that's kind of my background.
Uh-huh. Nice balmy Chicago.
A nice mom in Chicago. And there were a lot of brunettes versus a lot of blondes versus up in Minnesota.
Well, let's take a sneak peek into what's coming up, ages 22 to 28. When I was 22 is when I joined the Army, so that was a major undertaking. May 22nd, 1978. I remember I raised my right hand and swore to defend the Constitution. That's a date that you come to remember. They call it your pay entry basic date in the service. So for the rest of your career, you're always writing that date. So I remembered very specifically. And graduated from rabbinical school when I was 25, took a job in Davis, California. So my top job criterion has always been weather. I spent, up until age 25 in the Northeast, growing up in New York, college in Massachusetts, grad school in Philadelphia. So the minute I finished school, the first thing was I wanted to live somewhere warmer. So I lived for 2 years in Davis, California. And the best thing that happened there was I met my future husband, David Rubenstein. We saw each other. I heard about him before I ever met him. He was a notorious character in town. Those of you who knew David could imagine. He was quite a striking character in the community. So he was in Japan at the time that I moved to Davis. He had been invited to do a peace walk from Tokyo to Hiroshima and Nagasaki with a group of Buddhist monks. So he literally walked 1,000 miles, and they arrived at the anniversary of the bombing in Hiroshima. And then he came home to be home in time for Yom Kippur in Davis. So I had already heard about him, and had a sense that this was a pretty interesting individual. And when he walked into Kol Nidre services, I was standing on the bima, and I saw him walk in from the back, and I said, "Oh, that must be that guy they've been telling me about." And then he obviously noticed me because he was there an hour before services started the next morning, and he came up to the bima very somberly and introduced himself. And then our Davis, California, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's outside Sacramento in Northern California, and it's famous for having more bicycles than people. So everybody bikes everywhere. The city has an ordinance that you have to have major bike lanes everywhere. So it's a great bicycling town. And the synagogue had a gigantic bicycle parking lot. And at the end of Sukkot services, David somehow was the last one there. I was unlocking my bike. He was getting his bike. And he said, "Oh, which way are you going? I'll ride you home." So that was how we connected, and then got married and moved to a congregation in North Carolina, again looking for warm places, Greenville, North Carolina, for a couple of years. And then this position became available in Mesa, Arizona. And my mother told me she couldn't find Arizona on a map. She, like, where is Arizona? But we moved to so my first child was born, I guess we're only going to age 28, 22 to 28. So no children yet. So we were engaged, we were moving, got married at age 29 and had Jesse at 30. So I'll just hold it there. So I would say ages 22 to 28 for me were about graduating, getting my first jobs, and meeting David.
I think I talked before and I went too far.
Uh-huh.
I did not meet Stephen until I was 25.
Uh-huh.
We were married when I was 28.
There you go.
And so when I graduated college, undergraduate I had just turned 21. That was when every summer I was traveling, the first one all through Europe, and then the next summer in Israel. And totally different than any later experiences. I actually ended up living in a dorm room at University of Tel Aviv for a while for free, just having met some people who
just
had
like Joel.
What?
Just like Joel.
Oh, well, it was kind of like they knew people that had empty rooms, or their roommates weren't there or whatever. And I was alone for a while traveling, so that was especially nice to do. But when I was in, just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I was only going to add a couple of things because I think I told you most of it after that.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to also tell you when I was in my, so then I was teaching, and when I came back from Europe the first summer, it was after I had graduated college, there was a freeze on teachers because I don't kind of remember why now that there was a freeze on hiring new teachers. So there were no jobs. And I didn't in Philadelphia, which is where I thought I wanted to teach. Because as soon as I got out of college, first thing I did is I had an apartment set up where I was going to move to when I got back. So here I had an apartment and I didn't have a job when it turned out that they had this freeze while I was gone. So I didn't come back when I was going to. Finally, I got a job in Levittown for a year until I came back into the Philadelphia school system. But part of what I was studying when I went on with my master's degree, they had this ungraded primary classes, which sounded similar to what you had, Rabbi, in New York. So when I taught ungraded primary, it was kindergarten through first through third graders, and they could get through in 2, 3, or 4 years. So that was an interesting concept. And then I didn't leave Philadelphia. I mean, I didn't leave Philadelphia until after I was married with Steve. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, when you reminded me, I had my first trip to Israel when I was 17, so I didn't include that, but that was 1973, and it was a wonderful time to be in Israel. The Sinai Desert still belonged to Israel at that time.
Yes.
So it was wonderful. I remember camping out in the Sinai Desert under the canopy of stars and all the shooting stars, and going snorkeling in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was part of.
Oh, I got to talk to you about that.
Part of
We
Israel.
did the same thing, camping out on the beaches there with backpacks.
So yeah, that was a wonderful memory. I got to spend 6 weeks that summer.
There was one last thing I was going to add. I was just thinking for a second, because I was pretty poor. I didn't come from any money at all. I mean, even Temple University was on a scholarship, which was inexpensive. The only way I was able to travel, even though I had worked, I had not, the working that I did during summers was only basically gave me spending money to buy some clothes beyond what my parents, you know, gave me or could do for me. And the only reason I was able to travel those 2 summers, especially the first one, is because my grandparents, who had both passed away by the time I was about probably 11 or 12, they had the foresight to leave to each of their 10 grandchildren $1,000 of the $10,000 that they had was left to their estate. So instead of leaving anything to their children, they left $1,000 to each grandchild. So and we couldn't touch it until we were 21. So for me, when I turned 21, was exactly when I graduated college and was exactly when I planned on going to Europe. And it was because of that, I was able to travel on the Europe on $5 a day. And my parents actually did get the money together to gift me a Eurail pass, because they didn't want me to be hitchhiking or doing anything crazy. So anyway, that was kind of cool, because that money, $1,000 back then, went a long way. And I think
yeah, speaking of hitchhiking, I do recall hearing stories about my mom hitchhiking home from Brandeis. Would you like to share with us your, how old were you? You must have been, it must have been in this, no, it was under 22, because you were already married at 20. Yeah, you gotta unmute though.
It was your father who was hitchhiking. He hitchhiked.
I thought it was you.
He was hitchhiking up to see me.
Oh.
And he got pulled over by the police for hitchhiking. And he wound up having to come from Connecticut somewhere by bus up to come to visit me at Brandeis.
Uh-huh.
But 22 was when I had all my children. It was very special years, because I gave birth to 3 children, and that's when I started to get involved in volunteer work. I was busy with my synagogue right away. I joined a synagogue when you were 4 years old or 5 years old, so you could go to Hebrew school, and I right away became involved with that, and I moved to a wonderful area where we were all 99% were Jewish, and all with little kids growing up. And it was a wonderful time for us. We had our neighbors, we had block parties, we stayed out on the street, and we each watched each other's kids. It wasn't like it is today. I would leave you and your brother out on the street, and I'd leave money for ice cream for you on the porch, and I would go in and take a nap while your baby brother was sleeping. Could you imagine today doing something like that? It was such a different world. It was
probably get arrested for child neglect.
Yeah, but it was wonderful. It was really a
and my
wonderful.
mom had 3 kids under the age of 5, so I'm sure that was busy.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful, wonderful years. We lived in Mill Basin, really nice neighborhood. And
yeah, it was a great time and place to grow up.
Yeah. It was before we had to worry so much. You didn't have to have play dates. You didn't have to have play dates. You went out on the street and had friends. Not like when you were when I was in the Flatbush area, where I couldn't leave my kids out. Well, it was only my daughter at that time, because you couldn't leave her out on the street because it wasn't, she wasn't welcome as a Jew.
Well, I lived in Bergen Beach for a while before we moved to Phoenix.
Ah, so you were a neighbor.
Yeah. We're Avenue W.
Huh?
70th Street.
I've got to go. I've got a conference call at 2:15. So,
Okay, Joel, nice to see you. We're going to wrap up here in just a moment. We'll pick up next week with ages 29 to 35. So please be thinking back on that time. We'll say goodbye to Joel. And anybody have any final thoughts?
I thought you said 22 to 28. I wrote
That's
that.
where we are right now.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say, for me, for that period of time, I graduated high school when I was 21, and I got my first job. I actually had a major in chemistry, as I said, but a minor in business, because pretty much through school, I decided I didn't want to be in a lab the rest of my life. So I wound up in sales, chemical sales, specifically very technical side of the world. And the first job I got was with Allied Chemical. And it was a very challenging position because I really had trouble working. They stuck me in an office on the 4th floor of what was then the Allied Tower, which is 1 Times Square in New York. And I had an office looking down Broadway and 7th Avenue. And I could sit there and watch people all day, which was much more fascinating than working. So, I wound up there for a while and then wound up. So, to punish me for this, they transferred me to Buffalo. And I went up to Buffalo in the summer. I remember the boss that I had up there met me and handed me a box when I walked in. We had a company car. And the box contained a blanket, some flares, some tuna fish in cans, a few other odds and ends. This was my, in case I got stuck on the freeway in the snowstorm, this was my survival kit. But, it looked like it was going to be drafted pretty soon because this was 1966. And so instead of being drafted, I decided I was going to pick my spot, and I joined the Army and signed up for OCS, went into the Ordnance Center in school in Aberdeen, Maryland, and got pretty much through that. But then I was doing the obstacle course one day and I tore up my knee. And the orthopedist told me, I remember distinctly saying, Joe, he said, you have what I would refer to as Joe Namath knee. If you had it before you came in, we couldn't take you. But since you got it while you're in, we can keep you. So I wound up having to resign from OCS. And one of the guys in the dorm I was put in had done some research. And I don't know where he found this contact in the Pentagon someplace, but I got this woman's number. And I guess she was in charge of trying to find slots for people with specific opportunities. And so I wound up talking to her, and she got me an MOS, or military occupational specialty, of 01F20, which probably very few people know what that is, but it's a physical science research assistant. And I wound up being transferred down the road to Edgewood Arsenal, where I wound up spending about 18 months analyzing tear gas, which was a really fun job. But before that happened, Carol decided she didn't want to wait for me. So she said, if you're going to Vietnam, which was a distinct possibility then, she said, I'm not going to wait. We got to get married now. And I said, well, how are we going to do that? We decided to elope, which is what we did. We got married at the courthouse at Aberdeen, Bel Air, Maryland. And I really got in trouble right away from that because the Justice of the Peace who married us started reading from his little book saying, according to Article so-and-so, Section so-and-so, the Code of the State of Maryland. And the reason we were lucky to do that, by the way, Maryland didn't, and I don't think still does, require a blood test. So we were just able to show up one day, took a day off from work, came down, we got married, she went home. It was this guy's reading from this book, and I couldn't tell whether I was being court-martialed or married. But that was, and then our son was born a couple of years later when I was 23 at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. He cost us $8.25, And that was because we were on separate rations, so I had to pay for Carol's meals in the hospital. So but that's the story of that. So I'll just leave it right there for that period of time.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up there. I will look forward to seeing you next week, if not before. And as I said, I want you to start thinking about ages 29 and moving forward.
Okay.
And would love to hear from some of you who have not yet participated. So I'm not going to embarrass or call on anyone, but just know we'd love to hear a little of your story as well. Have a good week. I'm going to turn off the recording and.